Hello everyone, today we talk about the equipment of Cilician Armenians during the Crusades. So, this is the Cilician Armenians. First of all, are a bit some of the forgotten protagonists among the many that, of course, existed of the Crusade era, and I've seen it in popular culture, especially through video gaming and all. This idea that there had been the Cilician Armenians is somewhat a bit more out there. When I studied medieval history in school, actually I don't think I've ever even watched on a Near Eastern map of on the chapter of the Crusades, the Cilician Armenians, and this is something I also learned about relatively late in time, not recently, but at least I was surprised, generally speaking, that this people is not really considered. And today, as we have said, we will talk about the equipment of these guys, so it's essentially a military history video, but I think we have also to give a bit of background of who these guys were. Also because it's really understanding who they were that you can understand their equipment, their warfare, and all. So this is very important. First of all, we are in the Middle Ages. Like, I think everybody knows where Armenia is on a map. At least I hope. I also have certain, between Georgia, Armenia, I can't really. Just recently I was talking with a friend that was in vacations into Armenia. I saw a beautiful lake. I said, well, what is it? The Lake Van? Forgetting that the Lake of Van is in Turkey, not in Armenia. I remained with the ancient borders, let's say. But we're not in the migration era anymore, because here about the Cilician Armenians, we're talking essentially between the 11th and 14th century. In the Near East, that were pretty advanced areas of the world at the time. So what were the Armenians doing in Cilicia? That is the name. I don't know how they were called. I mean, I think Cilicia is a sort of classicism that has been used, especially in Latin sources, to describe the geographical location of this place. It's possible that even in the local language, the ancient classical name of Cilicia was actually used. I don't know. I think the Byzantines, especially Maya, and the Byzantines are the key of the whole thing here. But yeah, I'm probably saying something stupid. It probably has always maintained the name of Cilicia. It's that area essentially comprehended between today's Turkey and Syria. So it's usually, I think that the majority of the country is essentially, if not flatland, however, certain mostly flat coastal areas, although it opens basically into the Taurus Mountains. So it's a very strategic. It has a very today it's in Turkey actually, because Turkey expands far south, even up to Antioquia basically, and then Syria begins. However, at this time in the Middle Ages, there was no North Turkey. Well, Syria did exist, but it didn't exist. It existed as a region historically, but also as a culture, as a language and all. Syrian language was there, but it was a pretty multi-ethnic area, and this area of Cilicia was essentially a border, a frontier area of the Byzantine Empire, the southeastern frontier of the empire. So basically, when the Seljuk Turks, I made a video about the Seljuk Turks, if you want to learn a bit more about them, in the Medieval Islam playlist. So just for having more or less the coordinates, if you've never heard about them, to understand who they were, why they arrived into the Near East, what they did. Essentially, expanded into Armenia. Armenia is, historically speaking, it's always been, I don't know if you have ever looked at the geography of the lands south of the Caucasus. It's a sort of region on its own. I mean, this rather vast area that since classical times had always remained of relatively difficult control. It laid in the Parthian, let's say in the Roman-Persian frontier. It was Roman for a while, then mostly a sort of client state of both, chiefly of the Persians and then of the Romans. It changed according to the major offensive that were carried out in there. And essentially it remained a bit this mountainous area, always, it's a beautiful place, beautiful landscapes, beautiful, but it's also pretty hostile territory. There were probably also a lot of very warlike communities, especially on the mountains. These mountaineers from Armenia were pretty warlike in their traditions. But Armenia, in its, let's say, in its flatlands, in its valleys, has also developed a very advanced sedentary civilization that, since classical times, basically emerged as a mix of local Armenian, plus with Persian and Hellenistic influences. Then it's also pretty close to the world of the steppes. I mean, there is the Caucasus in the north that is this sort of chain that bit closes a little bit, but we know that mountains are never impassable, so there is all the world of the steppe outside. So Armenian military culture kind of developed between some of the most advanced militaries at the time. I mean, being influenced by that. Armenia has never been a huge military power, though mostly for political and social reasons, not because these guys weren't apt to warfare or not. This is also a great idiotic thinking that that there are certain people who are more or less apt to war. This is a typically racist or crypto-racist belief that many people still hold nowadays. It's simply that Armenia remained a sort of fragmented area, politically speaking. There was a kingdom at many times, but local families, the elites, the aristocracies, always had a sort of importance because they were a partially feudal land, essentially, for environmental reasons and also because of the influence of the Persian culture, while the Byzantines were not feudal, at least in this, in the canonic sense of the word. So when the Muslims conquered the Near East and they reached up to Armenia, essentially those areas. By the way, Armenia was Christian, famously. It has an Armenian church that basically stands on its own, and Armenia is also the first Christian country in the world. Historically speaking, even because they converted officially to Christianism before even the Roman Empire. So they always had this very fiercely Christian character, and when the Muslims arrived, there was definitely a lot of syncresis also in there. For what interests us in terms of military culture, you see that actually the Muslims were more influenced by peoples like the Persians or the Romans than what they were able essentially to influence in turn. And there's always been this kind of clash for which Armenia has been partially, I mean nominally sometimes, subjected to the Muslims, but for practically always fighting against them and always, let's say, remaining this frontier area that was very difficult to control as strategically, and that kind of developed the cradle of its own civilization, or the modern Armenian identity on its own. And yet, when I'm talking about the very first the very first Muslim waves of invasion. Then eventually, in the Low Middle Ages, from say the 10th, 11th, 12th century, the Seljuk Turks expand far and wide into the Middle and Near East. And Armenia is it's invested by the Seljuk wave. At that time, the major power in there was the Byzantine Empire that had begun to basically received the Armenian refugees from their motherland into this area of Cilicia. That was a frontier area, as we have said, so it was meant to, let's say, to re-establish part of the Armenian community in there, and to work as a sort of defense, because Armenia had been substantially subjected to the Seljuks. So these Armenians fleeing into the Byzantine Empire, was Christian as they were given essentially this sort of last stand in Cilicia. Of this land that was all that remained to them in terms of autonomous administration. This is a moment in history in which these practices of let's say demic replacement were actually pretty common, even if there was definitely not a great deal of demographic density, especially in places like Armenia and all, but this was all the more important because if you put someone in certain areas, they could form substantial communities. I mean, in terms of cohesion and all, because if there were already a few people, if only it was enough just to take another few of them to make them many for the local standards. So, as we've said, Cilicia was the gate for Anatolia, especially from the south. And therefore their position there had a great strategical meaning, because the Byzantines thought that placing the Armenians there would have given them a reason to resist till the very end, and they definitely resisted even longer than what the Byzantine Empire did in the area, telling the truth, as we will see. So to protect the Taurus gates, essentially, and to have this kind of, I don't know how you say that in English, but strategically speaking, it's having a buffer state. That's the term I was searching for, a buffer state against Muslim advance, and that was very, very important, because the Byzantines were definitely quite worried about the Seljuk advance, and very rightly worried, by the way. And settling a whole people in Cilicia definitely took them from Byzantine military administration all the costs that derived from holding that region. Think about I don't know, the garrisons, the castles and all. So these were also regions that evidently the Byzantines weren't able to rule with an iron fist, because at the time the Byzantine Empire, telling the truth, was pretty strong, and they still ruled in Cilicia with a military presence together with the Armenians. But let's say that generally speaking, on a great distance, tendentially, central authority tended to vanish. The Byzantine Empire was one of the most centralized, actually probably most centralized power at the time, at least within the Christian powers, and it definitely could send armies in there, but it's already a time in history in which, the idea of stationing permanent armies in one place didn't exist anymore. There was usually a mobile army that was placed somewhere like in Constantinople or Asia Minor, and that from there had this deterrent power without having to station soldiers in every single center of the empire. Also because, let's say that aside from Constantinople itself and perhaps Thessalonica, but on a much smaller scale, in practice the Byzantine Empire didn't have any other major center. So it was all local communities of urbanism had quite had decayed, and also the Constantinople tried to keep it under check, in the sense that Constantinople and its and imperial elites didn't want other centers like to expand more than much. So The idea was to have this area that was controlled, sometimes even nominally, but that as long as it paid taxes, as it made trade functioning and agriculture producing, the better it was. And all it took was to keep those regions pacified more than else. And there was no other major, threat from within the imperial borders. So at such a great distance from the capital, Cilicia was better off with the Armenians than with a stronger Byzantine presence. So the problem, though, is that the Byzantine authority began to collapse into the area because after the Battle of Manzikert, that is this major defeat of imperial forces occurred in 1071 at the hands of the Seljuk Turks of Alp Arslan, that eventually created the Konim Sultanate practically into the center of Anatolia, so taking away from the Byzantines this hugely important strategic area of the empire, because it was the place where the Byzantines raised its best their best cavalry, the famous Byzantine heavy cavalry at this time. Let's say that the Armenians were left a bit on their own, and they began to act, however, at that point as a practically independent power, and with a certain degree of strength, in the sense that at that point there was a major Armenian presence in Cilicia. The Armenians were definitely not the only ethnicity that existed in there, but they had managed to build a sort of principality that eventually was became formally a kingdom. So also in here there wasn't really centralized government. It was something very feudal in form. There were lots of different princes with their military retinues. They had their own power. Excuse me, I drink a little. And they began in this phase there was already a phase of crusades, because Manzikert is 1071, First Crusade is 1095. So in these 20 years, basically the Armenians passed from a strong Byzantine influence to a strong Frankish influence, plus obviously the Muslim influence was broadly all around. This conferred even to the Cilician Armenian culture a degree of, let's say, multi-ethnicity and of variety that is reflected also in its equipment and organization. So I'm not gonna go further now the history of the Armenian Cilicians. Let's say that they were usually allies with the Franks. I say usually because sometimes these are painted as if everyone that was Christian was friend to each other. They are against the Muslim. Completely false. The Christians, including same Crusaders, allied themselves with the Muslims against other Crusaders and all. It happened all the time. The Armenians were at this point probably more pro-Frankish than pro-Byzantine, because, by the way, Byzantines, especially during the 12th century, had regained a substantial power, especially in the coastal areas of Anatolia. They were clashing pretty intensely against the Sultanate of Iconium. And the Cilicians were pretty sneaky, telling you the truth. I mean, as everyone in there, because nobody wanted their own neighbor to gain excessive power. As the Crusaders didn't want the Byzantines to grow at too great influence in there. I mean, the Cilicians were the first ones that were in contact with the Byzantines, so they were the first ones who didn't want that. But the Cilician Armenians were also involved into the local Crusaders quarrels between the various principalities that the Franks had created in the Near East. at times maybe there were more allies with certain Muslims than with the Christians, but these are things. I mean, the history of the Crusades is extremely complicated. I would say overly complicated. Also because it wasn't just about the Near East. I mean, these powers were really involved into the whole international politics of that time. I mean, this is a time into which, I don't know, things that were happening in northern Italy maybe had a huge effect of what was happening to the Near East in terms of the balance between the Holy Roman Empire, the Frankish kings, the French kings, the Byzantine Empire, and the Hungarians. You know, I mean, it was really messy like that. So there is not a linear thing. You say these were Christians, these were Muslims. No, it doesn't make any sense. Please erase religion in this sense from strategical reasons, because there was, but it was definitely minor compared to the whole thing. These were essentially a bunch of principalities, each one trying to enlarge its power at the expense of the others. Doesn't matter who they were. So in this sense, the Armenian position here is in Cilicia is extremely fascinating, because it was also relatively small power compared to the others. I mean, the giant there was the Byzantine Empire, but definitely the Kingdom of Jerusalem, or possibly even the Principality of Antiochia, were I don't know really at times how more powerful, but because there are accounts in chronicles that say like that these Cilician Armenians were quite numerous, also demographically speaking. There are chronicles that obviously are inventing. I mean, they're exaggerating by saying that the Armenians in Cilicia had like 100,000 men, but this is rubbish. That let's say was a daily business in chronicle writing at the time, especially. I would say in the Near East, because in there it wasn't like, you know, the chronicles were really written. It wasn't like a middle class that had this huge advancement in analytic understanding, as you could find, I don't know, in communal Italy, where you know everything literally about every single number, every single military clash in detail. With this is just those chronicles were essentially just either praising or demonizing a certain power, and even by demonizing sometimes, if you were writing about an enemy, you could say that this guy had, I don't know, millions of men, or I don't know. I think at that time they didn't arrive even at these lies, but definitely 100,000 soldiers in Cilician Armenia is completely false. Probably at the height of its power, these Armenians could have, I don't know, maybe, because it's difficult, even in medieval history, it's difficult even to understand what we mean by soldiers. If it is a theoretical number of people who can take arms, maybe yes, you can even reach very large numbers if you take the least of all the potential feudatories, or the militia, the levies and all. There could be consistent numbers, theoretically speaking, but the idea is that these powers at the time couldn't really field more than some thousand, let's say. With the case of the Armenians, let's go see that we see essentially a couple of thousands of cavalry and a couple of some thousands of infantry, sometimes in certain expeditions. So I don't really know, but probably I think that the world forces of the Armenian Cilician Armenians didn't surpass. I'm just searching, really. So forgive me for this, but I got curious now, so I want definitely to know. However, the tens of thousands. This is what I wanted to say. I couldn't find anything, but doesn't really matter. What really matters instead is that is the equipment that today I wanted to see, and the organization first, to actually understand. Because as we have said, let's say that people, at least for what I found on the internet, tend to say that the Cilician Armenians had a huge Frankish influence in military organization. Now, this is absolutely true, but sometimes I think even for the sake of pushing the idea that these Armenians were kind of Westerner, because there is a tendency to say that the Armenians are definitely Westerner. I consider them as Westerners. Plus they were Christian, which is an extra plus to, especially during the Crusader era, to determine essentially to which side you belonged. And definitely Frankish influence was very strong, especially during Crusader times, but even later, because eventually the Western presence in the Eastern Mediterranean remained there quite strongly, also material culture and all. But the idea is that at this time, even before the arrival of the Franks into the Near East, in the Crusades, because by the way the Westerners always went into the holy places at that time, like even before the Crusades, it was normal to see armored Westerners coming as pilgrim bodyguards to the Near East. So it was daily business, and there was a lot of, the Mediterranean at that time was really seeing a very broad expansion of the Westerners into everywhere. Either as mercenaries or as merchants and all. But more importantly, we must say that this is a characteristic of the High Middle Ages, independently from this or that influence, that it is the tendency in a world that is not, in general, where there is not a great political, social, environmental possibility to create very strong centralized kingdoms, to decentralize, obviously. And when we say feudalism, we don't have to think it's something that the Westerners invented, because feudalism is a form of political and social organization that has always been out there in many societies. Now, the Westerners at this time, I think, were pioneering the feudal system in a much more intense form than what it was seen in the East. So the Westerners had risen to this even model feudalism that was exported not just with arms, but also with culture, with this idea of lifestyle, of ethical values and all. But the majority of powers at the time were definitely something similar to feudalism. Having a bunch of princes that have, as we were saying, their own military retinue, living in two castles, having estates all around. I mean, this was pretty standard at the time. And relatively to the influences that the Cilician Armenians might have got, aside the Persian one, that was pretty strong, especially in the Seljuk Turks that were quite influenced by the Persians, now in truth even more than from the Arabs. And then instead had a more centralized fashion organization, because the Persians were living into this Iranian plateau that was historically a feudal land, essentially, in the organization. While the Arabs had developed instead in these very large fertile plains, like in Egypt, in Mesopotamia especially, the caliphate had been built around cities. So it was not really feudalism in itself, even though they were practically spreading it, because, by the way, the Ayyubids in Egypt were there was a lot of Turkish influence all around. It was kind of exporting partly the feudalism of the steppes and of Persia. But even the Byzantine Empire, that, as we've seen, was the cradle into which Cilician Armenia was created, was shifting towards a sort of feudalization of the empire. If the empire had not been destroyed during the Fourth Crusade, probably it would have kept growing increasingly similar, even in these great forms of political and social organization, to the Western feudal kingdoms. And the Byzantines themselves, by the way, had began to develop the so-called pronoia system. That is a sort of feudal system in practice, although a bit different, because in the Byzantine Empire survived the central authority that could claim those lands back, but let's say de facto, the same Byzantine Empire was growing as a sort of Constantinopolitan private dominion, let's say. Domain and dominion, because the empire was really in the hands of fewer and fewer families gravitating around the imperial court, and essentially having these houses in Constantinople that were fed and maintained by large areas of the empire, like especially the imperial court usually had Crete as a major source of supplies and all for, because Constantinople basically was the only big, enormous metropolis at that time in the empire, and basically the whole empire was feeding it, and in this process the whole regions of the empire had grown increasingly subjected to this central government that, however, in this sense was also partly decentralized, because the empire, as we've said, didn't belong to a single person, to a state in the impersonal sense of the word, but it really belonged to the various families that owned the various regions of the empire, that were always essentially in the imperial family, but there were also other aristocracies rising locally. So the Byzantines themselves had created something relatively similar to the also for the recruitment of the army to what was happening in feudal Europe. And how couldn't really the Cilicians be influenced by this? So people, as I was saying, like to say that feudalism was introduced eventually by the Crusaders, by the neighboring Antioch, by the way, Antiochia. There was one of the major powers among the Crusader states, was the Principality of Antioch, founded by Bohemond of Hauteville during the First Crusade. And there is a great, definitely influence of the even of certain terms, of a certain vocabulary. For instance, the Armenians. The Armenians had, by the way, in their own lands, as we have said, in Armenia proper, a sort of feudal system on their own, partly derived from the Persians, partly local. This parapet and the nakarar were, for instance, two very important titles. I think this parapet was something like a major military commander, often associated to horse command, essentially, while the nakarar is, traditionally speaking, the Armenian nobility, the Armenian knights, essentially, as we say, the miles in Western Europe. The nakarar was it was even more, actually, because the nakarar was something, I don't know at this point now, but there were certain nakarar families that were extremely old, and there had always been a sort of major feudal families into Armenia that predate even the oldest Frankish nobilities. I mean, something could be even traced back to the ancient history, I believe. So Armenian society probably was structured already in a much more feudal fashion since the beginning than what the eventually Franks could do. But definitely, Sparpet was substituted by constable, constable, and Nakarar by baron. So you see that here, it's essentially a it's a name's replacement, and that witnesses definitely the very strong Frankish influence, but that could be attached to a society that was already similar to the Frankish one. The Frankish influence also seems to have come to predominate into Cilician Armenia, particularly between the, let's say, from essentially the beginning of the 13th century. So in a moment into which Frankish feudalism was at its peak, into which the Byzantine Empire also had been wiped out by the Franks with the Fourth Crusade. So into which a moment into which French influence in Europe and the Mediterranean was extremely strong. And that therefore kind of makes sense to maybe identify even the Christians as the Franks, even with the French at this point, from an Eastern perspective. Because seriously, apart from the Italian sailors that definitely were in strong contact with these communities even long before the Crusades, those who actually, I mean, the model of rule as land rulers around the Mediterranean was the French one. The French exported feudalism into Greece, into Asia Minor. Well, actually, they never directly ruled in there, but there were lots of Western knights that settled even into Anatolia. So while the Italians just cared about having their own port and making money through that and coming back home, the French were really building up dominions into the Mediterranean that were definitely the example that these powers were following. Also because this French feudalism was definitely a successful model. I mean, up to that time they had managed to invade the Near East, to destroy the Byzantine Empire, to seize a huge power into Europe. So, I mean, even the idea is, oh my god, these guys are pretty effective, and definitely in this sense, the Cilician Armenians were influenced, militarily speaking, from the French, and also because the feudalism is essentially also a military model. I mean, the whole deal about feudalism is essentially having is giving a guide enough land to maintain a strong military retinue. And fielding, heavy cavalry, essentially. So that had proven to be quite effective, even in the Eastern world during the Crusades. Western cavalry had proved to be quite effective even against the Muslims. Sometimes we get this defeatism when we talk about the Crusades, because ultimately the Muslims, first of all, kicked out the Crusaders out of the Near East, but secondly because, I don't know, there is this idea that the Muslims had this hit-and-run tactics, combined tactics with the composite bows. They were so terrible, but if you actually look at the majority of clashes that occurred during the Crusades, actually from a tactical point of view, the Western cavalry had always the better hand over, and they won if they had the ability and the chance to make the right maneuvers, if they had the right leadership to defeat those tactics. Then obviously, as we all know, the history of the Crusades is dotted in the Near East, especially with this huge amount of terrible crusader Crusaders' military disasters, but it's not that was the. There are many other factors aside from the strictly tactical ones. I mean, the military, the tactical traditions of the individual peoples that actually make determine the result of a clash. So in turn, basically, you could say that the Armenian knight of Cilicia definitely looked like a Frankish one at a point. And it doesn't make sense to distinguish them, as in many other times in history. First of all, because also Western knights weren't all equipped in the same fashion. Secondly, because the Armenians wore evidently Frankish equipment. We are told from sources that some of them were indistinguishable from the Frankish ones. So we're talking about coat of mail, lance, sword, let's say secondary weapons, iron helmets, and even kite-shaped shields. So the typical Crusader, Western Crusader equipment. And we've got mainly, I don't know how archaeologically speaking how much evidence we have, because archaeologically speaking, if you look at the equipment that we can find dated to that time, local military culture is pretty it's so thickly mixed between Byzantine, Frankish, and Muslim influence and Persian usually influences that at a certain point it doesn't even make much sense to distinguish the various things. But definitely we've got illuminations from certain manuscripts that show us mostly the Armenian nobility with their retainers wearing mail, but also scale armor. It was pretty widespread at the time, even among the Crusaders, and not just because of, let's say, of local influences, because definitely scale armor was present even in, I don't know, the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. There were, I mean, there wasn't any concept of standardization at this point. There was plenty of scale armor all over the Mediterranean, so it doesn't make sense considering the Crusader, like you see in movies, as uniformly wearing all the coat of mail, essentially. There were definitely much more composite fashions, and these were seemingly of, especially of Byzantine influence, because the Byzantines had pioneered this the individual armor technologies at that time, especially in the West. I've made several videos about the Byzantine cataphracts. You can go take a look in the into the Byzantine history playlist, which give you a pretty decent idea of what the heaviest knights in all over the Near East, really, not just in the Byzantine Empire, could really be like. The Byzantines, I should premise, however, that the Byzantines were a very big empire that could field, during the 11th, 12th centuries, very large bodies of extremely heavily armored knights. Powers like the Armenians of Cilicia tendentially were poorer, and when you're poorer, you tend also to rely maybe on medium cavalry, medium units in terms of armament, because they're practically more effective, more versatile. The Byzantines had all bit this old Hellenistic taste, let's say, for the big show-offs. You know, the idea of, look at how many tough guys we can field. Definitely, Byzantine cataphracts were pretty effective tactical unit on the field. But it still costed a huge lot. It's probable that the Armenians of Cilicia wore, on average, a bit like the Crusaders, coat of mail, some scale armor, but nothing excessively heavy, at least in large numbers, like the Byzantines like it to boast. And this is telling the truth also. A bit true also for the Byzantines as well, because sometimes we get a bit the theoretical picture of how it was. Then in practice, probably also the Byzantines didn't field such like thousands of heavily armored cavalry. It's probably more effective in tactical terms to have more agile troops, something that you can ascend into various situations, not really like just a big pitched battle into which you can essentially field these guys that will only charge straight ahead because they can't do very complex maneuvers due to their weight and all. So here, the guy in the picture, the background picture that I chose, is probably the standard heavily armored Cilician Armenian knight. You see here, it doesn't even have horse armor, which was something extremely expensive and that it always remained very rare on the battlefield in medieval times. Actually in all times, because there weren't times where armored cavalry was normal. Was the average horse armor protection. So you see this guy has a round shield. It's a typical Eastern fashion conical helmet. This is typical also of the Byzantines, so it kind of gives you the idea. It has the aventile, so this coat of mail that covers the whole face and just leaves the eyes opened. This is also the helmet has I don't know how frequent it was, because usually I thought that helmets had sort of protective eye slits, but here it's under the skull cap. Here instead you see that the eye slit is carved partially into the skull cap. But however, and you see this aventile that basically covers the guy's also the guy's shoulders, and the coat of mail over with long sleeves. I can't see here the armor, leg armor, but probably really wasn't. So this sword is similar to, I think here are usually Muslim Persian models. The straight sword, especially, it's typical of the steppes tradition, and that's pretty much it, right? The round shield here, you see that something lighter. There weren't just kite-shaped shields at this time. It was chiefly the Franks who were using that, even though they were used partially also in the East. The round shield simply is lighter, so it can even imply a more dynamic fight. Maybe this guy, I don't see the legs here, but definitely he had one somewhere. Let's say that this kind of heavy cavalry, but not hyper, ultra, super heavy one, and it was a pretty versatile knight, just like the average of the Crusader, Byzantine, or Muslim ones, let's say. And there was pretty much a lot of syncretism, definitely, into this. And so the as we've said, the Frankish equipment probably had predominated, especially since the especially in the 13th and early 14th century. where there was still pretty direct, let's say, Western influence. Acre falls into 1291. So after that, you don't find an excessive number of Westerners into the Near East. I think the Cilician Armenians were chiefly a land power. I think if they had any fleet or anything, they just had some certain Italian ships, something like that, with Italian crews and all. Like, it was the normality for in the Crusader era. But so they were probably more influenced by the Muslim neighboring terrestrial powers than at that point, more than by the Franks. And there is, however, still a very strong Byzantine influence in their own equipment. And this had always been there, practically, in spite of more or less Frankish, say, weaker, stronger Frankish influence. Relatively to the kite-shaped shield, it's still possible that the Armenians adopted it from the Byzantines. The kite-shaped shield is not considered really a Western invention. I mean, it might have developed in parallel in the West, but definitely it was already present in the East. The Byzantines, there is evidence of that, or at least indirect evidence of that from certain Byzantine sources. So the kite-shaped shield might have been part of the Armenian equipment already from before the arrival of the Crusaders in the Near East. The general look, however, of, aside from armor, weaponry and armor, I'd say that the usual clothing in terms of garb, let's say, was definitely Eastern. The cap worn by certain of this, they were made up obviously in cloth or into, I don't know, whether into felt, were typical of Armenian and Jewish traditions, let's say, and since actually very ancient times, headwears in the Near East has always been these kind of the Phrygian cap, I don't know how you call that, with the covering your head but having then a sort of point at the top. And interestingly, also the Crusaders had begun to wear it because it eventually was pretty comfortable for the local weather. And many Armenians also wore turbans. So and seemingly all Armenians wore beards as well. So this might be some standard feature of Armenian warriors if you ever see them depicted, but it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish that from any other Near Eastern people in practice. Interestingly, also relatively to infantry, we have chiefly talked about cavalry. So this kind of average knight that resembles the Western models, with coat of mail, surcoat, metal helmet, sword, round or kite-shaped shield, and all. However, that is elite, really. And at this time in history, usually manuscripts and other iconographic sources like to depict the elite. So, but we have to think that just like it was happening in Europe, the majority of the troops being fielded weren't really elite. because the elite is what it is. I mean, it's elite also in numbers. Metal armor was extremely expensive. Only the feudal aristocracy could afford such an expense, together with the ones deriving from fighting on horseback. And all the let's say the resources needed for collective training on horseback with other knights and all. But the majority of the troops would wear lighter equipment. In Cilician Armenia, essentially, there are two weapons that are very widespread. The spear, not surprisingly, because it was the most common weapon also in Europe, as well as in the other area of the world, but also the bow, which is something that in the West you don't really find much this time. There were lots of crossbows, as we know, and but bowmen, especially of lower status, let's say, were a presence that especially feudalism had kind of erased in part from Europe, because the feudal elite didn't want the peasantry to be armed. It could be in order to avoid revolts and all. So here in the East, instead, the use of the bow is much more widespread, historically speaking. The Eastern world attached to the bow a great significance, differently from the West. There were very different traditions. And the Seljuk Turks, that were like the dominating military culture into the Near East, were had a sort of feudal character, a bit like the Westerners. They said that they were a bit even liking each other, because they recognized part of the chivalric ethics they had in common. However, the Turks historically were also horse archers, and horse archery was widely spread, and even the commoners, peasants in here, they were probably also a little bit freer than in the West, in the Muslim countries. Seemingly made a more extensive use of the bow. Obviously, they weren't this huge force, because foot bowmen just, especially if they're not even particularly armored, because they were foot armored archers at that time. Some elite, usually it could be also the same knights that had dismounted and used the bow on foot in the Eastern world. But this was a sort of more than else a support element that in this sense could be easily wiped out by the heavier cavalry and all. But it might have well been that it worked as a very effective support force, because the idea is that bows are extremely effective, especially against cavalry, which is usually using unarmored horses. So that's from Western feudal standards, was conceived as a sort of unchivalric thing, and that's the reason why the feudal elite had disarmed peasantry from slings and bows. But in the East, evidently, it wasn't like that, or at least we can spot a little more of missile weapons among the peasantry, among the lighter troops. So probably the Armenian forces were, in this sense, conceptually very close to any other army of the time, because it doesn't even make sense to stress differences excessively, because this is not what conceptually warfare was and is, because warfare is always the same in our world, let's say. People, like for wargamistic reasons, like to draw differences, to say this was like that, this looked like that, this did this, and this other did another, a different thing, so that we can distinguish. Really, you can't. but there are some common, let's say, certain elements that you can't find in both, say, multiple militaries that maybe are more pronounced in one and less pronounced in another. So this thing about the bow has to be read in this way, because definitely also Crusader armies had bowmen. Definitely because they recruited these guys from the same place from which the Byzantines or the Muslims or the Armenians recruited them. So it's really about society. You know, when you talk about the composition of armies, you have to look at politics and society point, because that's where those are the criteria on the base of which you raise an army, and therefore you shouldn't be excessively. And at this time, it's not that arms were that diversified. I mean, it was already the same old story: infantry and cavalry, and then more. It could be either missile cavalry, missile infantry. That's it. That's really it. There is nothing else. There were siege engines, but you know, they were used in sieges, not in fact, not in pitched battles, at least not regularly. And gunpowder was actually this time came out at the end of the 13th century, but it was nothing decisive and it wouldn't be for centuries to come. So I don't know how in depth I talked about these Cilician Armenians. I will kind of come back talking about them sooner or later, because I'd like to go a bit deeper into their actual history, not just their military, and also about their military organization. Probably there is something more to talk about. But for now, the important thing is that there is a video out there that talks about them, because there is really not much about them all around. Maybe making people more sensible to their existence is really something we can do in order to better our historical knowledge. Okay, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. I don't know how it really turned out. There are certain videos I like the way I make them, the others not so much. This wasn't not so much because there was no great substance to the subject matter, but perhaps we managed to tell something else that was interesting. And if you enjoyed it, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested to receive further news about my new videos. And for now, I just thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.